Welcome to the Explainer. I am so incredibly thrilled you're joining me today because, well, we're going to unpack a truly brilliant literary toolbox. Have you ever read a deeply complex text, like a biblical passage, and just wondered how the author manages to pull all those strings to make you feel or think a certain way? Actually, before we look at history, culture, or ideology, we absolutely have to look at the words right in front of us. So today, we're exploring Vernon K. Robbins's framework for doing exactly that. We're going to dive into the 6 dimensions of what he calls inner texture. It's literally a way to completely unlock the internal dynamics of a text.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our 5-part roadmap for today. First, getting inside the text. Second, repetition and progression. Third, narration and structure. Fourth, arguments and aesthetics. And finally, the complete textual framework.
Section 1. Getting inside the text and understanding inner texture. Before we can even ask what a text means in the grand scheme of history, we've got to ask how it operates as its own self-contained world of artistry. Inner texture is the absolutely crucial first stage of socio-rhetorical interpretation. We're focusing strictly on the internal dynamics, the words, the phrases, the structures, the voices, and the rhetorical strategies. The whole purpose here is to gain an intimate, up-close understanding of how the text generates meaning entirely on its own. We're mapping its literary design before we ever step outside to look at external contexts. We are strictly looking at the text itself. Section 2. Repetition and progression, or the flow of words and ideas. The very first tool in our toolbox is repetitive texture. This examines the repeated occurrence of words, phrases, grammatical constructions, or even entire themes. Now, this isn't just about counting words like some kind of human calculator. Robbins argues that repetition is actually one of the primary ways an author creates emphasis and literary cohesion. By spotting what repeats, we as interpreters can immediately identify the major themes, the central focus of the discourse, and the author's underlying communicative strategy. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what we're talking about. Consider the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verses 17 through 22. In this short narrative, we see the repeated word inherit right alongside repeated references to the commandments. By noticing this repetitive texture, we don't even have to guess what the author cares about. The repetition literally screams it out loud. It proves that eternal life, inheriting it, and obedience to the commandments constitute the absolute central concern of this specific narrative. So let's move to our second tool to see how this builds. Progressive texture. If repetition is about what stays the same, well, progression is about what changes. This texture traces how those repeated words and ideas actually develop into a sequence or an escalation throughout the discourse. Instead of just noting that an idea exists, we're asking how the argument or the story actually advances from one stage to another. This uncovers narrative development, theological progression, and ultimately, the climax. Think about the story of the blind man in John 9. His understanding doesn't just appear all at once, right? It escalates sequentially. First, he refers to the man called Jesus. Then his understanding progresses to calling him a prophet. From there, it escalates to recognizing he is from God. And finally, it culminates in the ultimate climax, worshiping Jesus. The vital takeaway here is that this literal step-by-step progression itself is the theological message of the text. Section 3. Narration and structure, exploring voices and boundaries. Our third tool is narrational texture. This analyzes the actual voices telling the story and guiding the reader. We're studying who speaks, who narrates, and how the narrator structures the presentation. Are they using direct speech, indirect speech? Are there authorial comments? This is completely critical because it reveals the perspective from which the story is told and exactly how the narrator is attempting to influence you, the reader. A classic example of narrational texture can be seen all across the gospel narratives. The narrator will frequently interrupt a dialogue to directly explain a theological significance to you. They basically break the fourth wall. And this isn't an accident. It's a highly intentional narrational strategy to direct your interpretation of Jesus' actions. The voice of the narrator is essentially acting as your personal theological tour guide. Okay, tool number 4 is the opening, middle, closing texture. This dimension investigates the structural organization of a literary unit. We're basically finding the actual seams of the text. Robbins emphasizes that we need to identify exactly where the opening ends, where the middle begins and ends, and where the closing starts. By mapping out these literary boundaries, we can see the flow of ideas, understand exactly how an author introduces and resolves issues, and spot structural transitions that prepare us for what's next. Now, what's truly fascinating here is how reliably miracle stories follow this exact opening, middle, closing structural rhythm. Just think about how it flows. The opening introduces the problem. Someone is sick or in need. The middle features the direct interaction between Jesus and the needy person, and then the closing features the healing itself, followed by the reaction of the crowd. This specific, repeated structure is exactly what gives these stories their profound rhetorical impact.
Section 4. Arguments and Aesthetics. Looking at logic and emotion.
Tool number 5 is argumentative texture, which examines the reasoning within the discourse. But actually, listen closely here. We are not just talking about dry, formal logic. We are talking about every single persuasive strategy the text employs. It looks at assertions supported by reasons, evidence, clarifications through contrasts, analogies, and logical explanations. It's all about uncovering the text's underlying persuasive strategy and theological argument. When you want to see argumentative texture at its absolute finest, you look at Paul's letters, and specifically the book of Romans. Romans is a literal masterclass in sustained argumentative texture. You can trace the exact persuasive strategy step by step. Paul makes a strong assertion, backs it up with scriptural proof, unpacks it with logical explanation, and finally drives it home with practical application. It is a relentlessly logical, persuasive architecture. But texts aren't just logical machines, right? They're deeply human. And that brings us to our 6th and final tool, sensory aesthetic texture. This dimension examines how a text evokes sensory experiences and aesthetic responses. Robbins argues that discourse engages us through sight, sound, touch, emotion, imagination, and even humor. This texture explores that experiential dimension. It's all about emotional impact, embodied meaning, and how actively involved you become in your imagination while reading. Think about how powerfully this works in the Passion narratives. Just feel the weight of this. Readers hear the cries, they see the darkness, they feel the suffering, they experience the fear and sorrow, and they participate emotionally in the crucifixion scene. The text here isn't just persuading you intellectually with a logical argument, it's persuading you experientially. It wraps around your senses and pulls you directly into the scene. Section 5. The Complete Textual Framework, or Mastering the Literary Toolbox. So the crucial point is this. Robbins gives us a comprehensive, highly interrelated framework. By looking for the repetitive, the progressive, the narrational, the opening, middle, closing, the argumentative, and the sensory aesthetic dimensions, we gain an incredibly profound understanding of a text's literary artistry and rhetorical force. We put all 6 tools to work to map the entire internal world of the discourse before we ever step foot into its historical or social context. And that leaves us with one final provocative question. The next time you open a text, before you rush to the commentaries to find out the historical context or the cultural background, how will you use these 6 dimensions to uncover the profound artistry hidden right there on the page? The tools are in your hands now. I absolutely can't wait to see what you discover when you start reading from the inside out. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and happy reading.